This is CGTN, China Global Television Network.
Chinese Foreign Minister Wang Yi is in Comoros on the last leg of his Africa visit. Africa CDC says the days of using lockdown as a tool for containing COVID-19 are over. And US President Biden castigates Donald Trump as America remembers the deadly US Capitol attack. Hello and welcome to Africa Live, only on CGTN. I'm Mahia Mutua in Nairobi. Ramanyang joins me now with your business headlines.
That's right, Mahia. Here's what's coming up in the course of the hour. We'll be in Ethiopia, where the Finance Ministry is seeking approval to increase its public spending. We'll have the details. And Tanzania is forecasting that its economy will bounce back in 2022 after the damage inflicted by the COVID-19 pandemic. The details on those stories and lots more coming your way in the course of the hour. For now, let's start with the latest in current affairs with Mahia.
Rama, thank you. Chinese Foreign Minister Wang Yi is in Comoros for the final leg of his Africa tour. Well, earlier we talked to Wen Pinghe, a research fellow at the Institute of West Asian and African Studies at the Chinese Academy of Social Sciences. She gave us a closer look at the importance of China's relationship with Africa.
Cooperation and political, those mutual trust, and also like human, people to people, this communication. So I can say in all kinds of way. For example, in terms of this economic cooperation, China has been now served as the #1 trade partner with Africa ever since 2009. If we look about China's benefit, of course, first of all, I think this is a mutually beneficial thing for China and Africa. But if we focus on China's side, I think first of all, we benefited a lot from this closer and closer China-Africa relations, those deeper and deeper China-Africa friendship. So that's why, we have been working so closely and in terms of a lot of issues, even in the international stage, like we both calling for the multilateralism, we are against those protectionism. So we both like calling for the deeper this economic globalization rather than saying de-link or decouple between those countries. So this is the one of the beneficial things. China now we would like to continue to strengthen our closer relation with Africa. And in terms of like economic cooperation, China also benefit, like lots of Chinese companies, entrepreneurships, they have been getting stronger in the way they engage themselves in the African, those projects. So Chinese companies going out this process, I think has been developed and getting stronger, with those projects finished in Africa continent. If we focus on mutually beneficial way, I think maybe two things we can focus more. #1 is we need to spend more efforts to strike a trade balance. That is to import more African-made those commodities. For example, I have already noticed that a lot of African companies, like lots of African countries, now they join this Shanghai Import Expo that has been, kicked off in China, the Shanghai city, ever since 2018. So China also now aims to transform ourselves from like a world factory to a world market. So Chinese customer is there, is ready. Now they are becoming the middle class and has a quite strong this consuming capacity.
Africa's top public health official says severe lockdowns are no longer the best way to contain COVID-19. Africa CDC Director John Nkengasong said this as he praised South Africa for adopting that approach when responding to its latest infection wave driven by by the Omicron variant. South Africa recorded a steep rise in COVID-19 infections when it alerted the world of the Omicron variant back in November. The country experienced a peak in infections in mid-December. Since then, the country has recorded a drop in new cases and announced the easing of restrictions before New Year's Eve. Nkenga Song said he fears that COVID-19 could become endemic on the continent given the slow pace of vaccination. Meanwhile, in South Africa, freedom of movement has been restored, boosting domestic travel. International travel restrictions, including bans, are also being eased in several countries, including key source markets such as the United Kingdom and the United States. CGTN's Julie Shire reports.
South African student Charles Morgan studies in the United States. He traveled home for the holidays as news of the Omicron variant surfaced, prompting travel bans on several southern African countries.
So we were aware of the travel ban when I came back to South Africa, but we were willing to take the risk because I wanted to spend the Christmas with my family. I had to get a COVID test before coming back to South Africa, 2 days prior to my flight. And other than that, no quarantine or anything, but it was tricky coming back.
US President Joe Biden has since lifted restrictions, but Morgan's trip back to the US was delayed.
We were already planning on going back to Cancun and quarantining there for 2 weeks. But then luckily, just as we booked the flights and packed the bags, he opened the travel ban and I could stay for a few more weeks.
For other travelers, the easing of restrictions by the US and other markets came too late.
We have seen an increased number of people traveling into the country and not too many people traveling out of the country. Countries like Mauritius still has South Africa on the red list, and it's a big market for South Africans who wants to travel outside of the country.
It had a negative impact because we are more dependent on international arrivals to sustain our tourism value chain. And when people visit South Africa, they don't want to come to just one country, you know. They want to go to Botswana, they want to go to see Swaziland. So this travel ban had a negative impact on the entire SADC region.
Conditions at home are improving. A 21-month curfew was scrapped, boosting leisure travel and business trading hours over the festive period.
People, who are involved in hospitality and restaurants to be able to operate on normal hours, which is a huge achievement. We didn't restrict interprovincial travel. People could go to the beaches. So in essence, there was a trust in terms of the domestic travelers to say that we can book anywhere where we want to go.
Many international destinations remain closed to South Africa, but a robust recovery is expected in the local market. Leisure travel picked up significantly over the holiday. There's now a focus on boosting business travel, which dried up over the last 2 years. Julie Shire, CGTN, Cape Town, South Africa.
Mass demonstrations have again erupted in Sudan's capital, pressing for a return to civilian rule. Naba Mohideen has more now from Khartoum.
This is Bajdar Station, one of the gathering points in the capital Khartoum for the protest today. There is other gathering points. All of it is targeting to go to the presidential palace against the military takeover following the resignation of the civilian Prime Minister Abdullah Hamdok. Authorities have made different security measures. They block the streets of the capital. They block bridges with heavy vehicles, with containers, and heavy deployments of military, RSF, and security forces. They also shut down the internet connections and cell phones in order to stop the protesters from gathering and heading to the presidential palace. Protest groups have announced at least 6 mass demonstrations in January alone. They also called for more escalation if the military continue in taking unilateral decision. The resigned Prime Minister warned of chaos if the violence continues against the protesters and if the political powers fail to find a mutual ground. Naba Mohideen, CGTN, Khartoum, Sudan.
Well, it's time for us to take a short break, but do stay with us. There's plenty more still to come on Africa Live.
So this is it. I'm just about to be shot.
Tents here, bottles are being thrown as they do so.
There are about 3 critical bridges here in Malawi. That's one of them. We're going to cross that bridge.
As you can see behind me, police forces
who are replying with gas. Gas just came in.
Tear gas, so it's all begun now.
Divisions leading the charge into West Mosul have brought us here.
Just got to be careful here with some gunshots.
This is where most of the fighting has been concentrated.
This is the front line now after 9 days of fighting.
We're about 2 to 3 kilometers from
within
the front
clear
line.
view of this front line position.
Welcome back and thank you for staying with us on Africa Live. Russia has sent troops to Kazakhstan as deadly riots continue in the city of Almaty. They're joined by military units from 5 former Soviet allies. Kazakh police say they've killed dozens of demonstrators after fuel protests escalated into the worst violence in decades. Nawid Jabarkil reports.
What started as protests against fuel prices has spiraled into something much wider in Kazakhstan. On Wednesday, protesters stormed the president's official residence and set it on fire in a sign of the growing anger boiling over in one of Asia's largest countries. Security forces say they've killed dozens of rioters on the streets of Almaty, the country's financial hub and largest city. Regional neighbors, including Russia, have now sent in troops to help at the request of the Kazakh president, has become a focal point of the demonstrators' anger.
The
terrorist mobs are essentially international. They underwent serious training abroad, and their attack of Kazakhstan should be viewed as an act of aggression.
The trigger for the clashes was a doubling of the price of gas, but the spread of the protests to Almaty and the capital Nur Sultan signify wider discontent, partly aimed at President Tokayev's predecessor Nur Sultan Nazarbayev, who'd ruled the country since the collapse of the Soviet Union. Despite stepping down in 2019, many think he still calls the shots.
Lots of versions of what happened here have been told. You have to understand what has happened here. The coiled spring has now been unleashed after 30 years. Look, all of us have been fired upon.
30 жыл жиналған пружина бүгін жазылды. Түнде міне атылдық бәрімізде.
Police say a dozen officers have been killed and more than 350 injured in the violence so far. Blood-stained and burnt-out vehicles, evidence of the casualties on both sides. Further afield, concern is growing over the protests and their impact on the wider region.
Obviously, following with concern and monitoring the situation in Kazakhstan, I think it's very important for all involved in these current events to exercise restraint, refrain from violence, and promote dialogue in addressing all of the pertinent issues.
Despite its vast natural resources, many Kazakhs feel they've been left behind by an elite that's profited from decades of oil-led economic growth. Kazakhstan's government has resigned because of the protests. As for President Tokayev, now backed by foreign forces, he's vowing maximum toughness in his response. On Thursday, thousands gathered again in the city of Aktau in another display of defiance. And with little sign of protesters backing down, the deadly standoff between police and the people may have some way left to run. Nawid Jabarkil, CGTN.
Protesters continue to be met with a violent response from the authorities in Kazakhstan, with reports from agencies saying that police had opened fire on protesters in a central square in Almaty, the largest city. And that comes after the police force confirmed that it had liquidated several dozen protesters overnight, their word for taking out extremists. They also said that several police officers had been killed, including a claim that some of them had been beheaded. More than 1,000 people have also been injured in the clashes. And this comes as the CSTO military alliance, a military bloc led by Russia, has deployed troops for the very first time in its history. There are peacekeepers from several CSTO countries that have already arrived in Kazakhstan. Most of them are Russian forces. And Russia and the government in Kazakhstan have both blamed the protests on external forces, saying that there had been foreign-trained extremists holding these protests, although there is no evidence to suggest that they had been organized from abroad. They started over fuel price rises, making life more difficult for Kazakhs, but many demonstrators also cited demands that the government crack down on corruption, as well as improving living standards for all Kazakhs. But certainly the response from the government has been very heavy-handed, and the involvement of other military troops suggests that they aren't going to let these protests continue for much longer. Julia Chapman, CGTN, Moscow.
Well, let's take you back to our top story this hour. Before heading to Comoros, the Chinese Foreign Minister Wang Yi was in Kenya. He met President Uhuru Kenyatta in Mombasa. China and Kenya also signed 6 memorandums of understanding touching on trade and infrastructure, among other sectors. The Chinese Foreign Minister and the Kenyan President also visited the new Kipevu oil terminus. CGTN's Nick Mudimba has more from Mombasa.
Another sign of fruits of the growing ties between Kenya and China. This is the new Kipevu oil terminus that's being constructed in Mombasa. President Uhuru Kenyatta and Chinese Foreign Minister Wang Yi visited the new facility, which, when completed, will double the capacity of transit petroleum products handled there from the current 35,000 tons. It's being financed by the Kenya Ports Authority and constructed by the China Communication Construction Company. The new Kipevu oil terminal will ease operations at the port. More ships will now be able to dock, and of course, without a doubt, oil capacity storage will now be improved. When finished, the new oil terminal will handle up to 4 vessels at a time, up from the current 1 vessel being handled by the old facility.
Today, I want to thank our partners, the People's Republic of China, for being there and walking with us hand in hand and meeting us at our point of need. And I am sure that as we move forward, with the kind of pace of development that we now have achieved, we will be able to say we have achieved an end to poverty. Kenya, Africa does not need lectures. Kenya, Africa needs friends willing to work with us to achieve our goals and our aspirations.
Kenya is currently undertaking many infrastructure projects, including major roads, with the support of China. The Chinese Foreign Minister took issue with false reports surrounding the nature of the funding of such mega projects.
The so-called debt is certainly not a fact. It is speculation being played out by some with ulterior motives. It's a narration by those who do not want to see development in Africa. If there is any trap, it is poverty and underdevelopment. China would like to welcome other countries friendly towards Africa to eliminate poverty.
But it's not just infrastructure where Kenya has benefited from Chinese support. The health sector too got a boost. Foreign Minister Wang Yi announced a further donation of 10 million vaccines to Kenya, a gift that's been warmly welcomed by the government.
China agreed, I believe, to donate 10 million doses? 10 million doses of vaccine under the planned 1 billion additional doses of COVID-19 vaccines to Africa.
And more cooperation between China and Kenya is the pipeline. The two countries signed 6 memorandums of understanding during Wang Yi's visit, including those touching on infrastructure, trade and investments. 6 Kenyan cabinet secretaries took part in the talks. China has also pledged more support for Kenya and neighboring countries in securing the continent and the Horn of Africa region in particular.
To support the Horn of Africa in realizing long-term security and stability, peace and transparency, China would like to put forward our thinking on peace and development in the Horn of Africa to support regional countries in tackling challenges in 3 areas, namely security, development and governance. We suggest that countries in this region may convene a conference on peace in the Horn of Africa in order to discuss in depth on this matter, to shape political consensus and to coordinate actions. China will appoint a special envoy of the Foreign Ministry on the affairs of Horn of Africa to provide necessary support for this process.
Kenyan avocado farmers are expected to benefit from protocols put in place from the export of the crop to China. Other strategic partnerships that were bolstered during Foreign Minister Wang Yi's visit include standing firmly to defeat COVID-19, to defend national sovereignty, continue to engage and play a bigger role for peace and stability in the region, working together to implement the FOCAC pledges and working hand in hand in poverty alleviation. Nick Mudimba, CGTN, Mombasa, Kenya.
Well, as we heard earlier, Chinese Foreign Minister Wang Yi is in Comoros for the final leg of his Africa tour. CGTN's Wilkista Nyabwa joins us now from the country's capital, Moroni, with more. Wilkista, has the Foreign Minister met with any dignitaries and our officials so far? And can you tell us more about the ties between Comoros and China?
Thank you very much, Mahia. Well, it has been a very activity-filled day for the Foreign Minister. He did arrive in Moroni, Comoros, shortly after 5 p.m. and was received by the Foreign Affairs Minister in Comoros, and then thereafter went into a meeting at the Ministry for Foreign Affairs. She came out of that and actually came to the Presidential Palace. As we are speaking right now, we are actually at the Presidential Palace, where just a few minutes ago, the Foreign Minister and the President addressed the nation and spoke about some of the issues that had come to the fore during their talks. And this really just goes back to talk about how far back the relationship between the two countries goes, going back to 1975, when China recognized Comoros after its independence. And therefore today, those are some of the issues that they were touching on, the areas of partnership that they have been able to work in the last few years, and what their plans are going forward. We did hear in the speech today both sides talking about how they have been working together and how China has been helping Comoros to battle COVID-19 and also to beef up its vaccination program so that they can protect more people and indeed eventually eliminate COVID-19. But also just talking about other areas where they can collaborate, some being health, because so far we have also seen Chinese researchers helping Comoros to battle malaria. So these are some of the areas. Of course, we do know that the two countries have worked together in other mutually beneficial ways, including that this country has received aid from Comoros, as well as in exports and in other areas. So these are some of the areas that they have been speaking about, how they can show up that relationship and how they can continue to build on that relationship in a way that ensures that both sides are able to benefit. Mahia.
All right, Wilkista, thank you very much for those updates. CGTN's Wilkista Nyabwa joining us live from Moroni, Comoros, on the sidelines of Chinese Foreign Minister Wang Yi's visit to the country. Moving on, U.S. President Joe Biden has accused his predecessor Donald Trump of posing a continuing threat to American democracy. Biden made these sentiments in a speech on the first anniversary of the deadly U.S. Capitol attack by Trump supporters who tried to overturn his 2020 election defeat. Biden warned that Trump's false claims that the election was stolen from him could unravel the rule of law and undermine future elections. Biden's direct attack on Trump was a departure for the president, who has spent most of his first year in office focused on pursuing his own agenda. Democrats and a handful of Republicans, though, warned that the damage done by Trump's efforts to undermine faith in the election he lost to Biden continues to linger on.
For the first time in our history, a president had not just lost an election, he tried to prevent the peaceful transfer of power as a violent mob breached the Capitol. But they failed. They failed. And on this day of remembrance, we must make sure that such attack never happens again.
Libya is facing a school textbook supply crisis, according to a spokesperson in the Ministry of Education. Many families are now looking for alternative study aids. CGTN's Joy Kirukijuma reports.
These Libyan students desire to pass exams, but they are unable to access the required textbooks and other necessary learning aids.
It's not just about the school textbooks, but students suffer even with affording the notebook. Notebooks are not cheap, pens are not cheap. The biggest problem is that schools require additional material. Schools ask students to get items that our fathers cannot afford to buy. We don't want to spend that much on stationery.
A lack of books, a lack of class preparation, and the students' inability to be ready for school adds more of a burden on families.
For many years, the government had been able to earmark a budget to provide free textbooks to each student at the start of the academic year. However, in the present situation, families are now forced to print out copies of textbooks, yet many can't afford to do this. This is amid deteriorating economic conditions and a political deadlock that has gripped Libya.
This issue is related to national security when it comes to the lack of books, especially during the start of the current academic year. There are only 10% of books that cover the needs of educational institutions, whether for primary or secondary education.
Libya has over 1.5 million students enrolled in schools. The ministry spokesperson says a committee formed to address the issue will hire local and foreign companies to print 34 million books to be made available soon. Joy Kirukijuma, CGTN.
In Russia, a project showcasing a detailed and interactive miniature model of the country's notable and historic landmarks has been unveiled. Let's take a look.
The Golden Ring is a popular tourist route passing through the ancient cities of northeastern Russia. It took 2 years for 157 people from various professions such as electronic engineers and artist model makers to manually create this project.
We liked especially the Russian folk fairy tales spotted around. Zmei Goranich, Ivan the Fool on the stove. We also liked very much the scene of the town Ivanovo with brides, as it is a town of brides, so it was very funny.
The model presents 5,000 residents and hundreds of buildings made interactive through thousands of meters of electric wire. There are special buttons launching various actions, such as cable railways and cable cars in the mountains. A team of 20 people monitor the ongoing operation every day to provide technical maintenance and repairs.
If there's an accident somewhere, a train derailed, a car that goes into a ditch, we go out to the field quickly and sort out these accidents. We take the cars away to repair.
The model recreates the atmosphere of landmarks in Russia through copies of famous architectural monuments and sites. When night falls, the cities are lit up in splendid colors. Zhang Mengyuan, CGTN.
Well, as we mentioned earlier, U.S. President Joe Biden has accused his predecessor Donald Trump of posing a continuing threat to American democracy. Biden made these sentiments in a speech on the first anniversary of the deadly U.S. Capitol attack by Trump supporters who tried to overturn his 2020 election defeat. Let's get more on that story now. We're now joined by our correspondent Nathan King, live from Washington, D.C. Nathan, U.S. President Biden has given an address on the anniversary of the Capitol attack. What would you say are the main highlights?
Well, it was an incredible speech in the fact that after essentially avoiding combating former President Trump in his first year in office, almost ignoring him, using the anniversary of the January 6th insurrection to basically go after Trump. Now, not in name, but essentially accusing the former president of holding a dagger at the throat of America, not only rallying the mob to come up here and basically attack the nation's capital 1 year ago, nearly to the hour, but also behind the scenes trying to steal the legitimate election that made Joe Biden and Kamala Harris his vice president as well. Essentially, he said that the US was still being tested on whether it can be a democracy, on whether it can move forward, and said that there are too many people in the Republican Party who back this big lie that somehow the election was illegitimate. And he basically tried to pave the way forward, as did his Vice President Kamala Harris, in voting rights legislation going forward to protect the votes, as they say, of all Americans, while some states in the US go in the opposite direction and try and limit voting, largely based on the premise of President Trump's big lie. I can tell you this will do nothing to dampen down the divisions, both here in the nation's capital, but also across the US. This is a gauntlet almost thrown down to the former President Trump, who, as you know, cancelled his press appearance just a few hours before this anniversary, although he did issue a statement shortly after Biden's remarks, basically accusing him of trying to distract attention away from his failed record.
And Nathan, the former president has come under intense scrutiny over the Capitol riots a year ago. Is American democracy then still considered to be at risk?
Yeah. Absolutely. You know that both the prosecutions of those responsible for entering the Capitol here, assaulting police officers that led to 5 deaths in relation to that day, is still going on. Merrick Garland, the top law enforcement officer of the Attorney General of the United States, said over 750 people were in custody and that they're prosecuting low-level crimes first, but don't rule out high-level crimes. And that's the big question, is whether you just prosecute the people who attacked here or people who instigated it. Now, we heard Donald Trump's speech on that day. Some would say that was incitement. And remember, there is a House Select Committee investigation, which includes 2 Republicans, who are about to hold public hearings that have already heard from former Trump administration officials. They have text messages that are urging Donald Trump, who was sitting there apparently watching it all unfold on television. With hours went by before he told people to go home. And the big question is whether he and his staff will be held not just politically accountable, but in some way criminally accountable. And this is all happening, of course, at the beginning of a new year, when there are midterm elections that decide the control of both the houses of Congress here behind me. So this is very much an anniversary, but this is not a red line. They are not drawing a line under this, the Democrats, as much as many Republicans may want it to go away.
All right, Nathan, thank you very much for speaking to us on Africa Live. Nathan King joining us live from the U.S. Capitol, Washington, D.C. Well, Rama is back in studio now to bring us the latest in business. Rama?
Thank you very much, Mahia. Here's what's coming up in business news. We'll be taking a look at a proposed supplementary budget from Ethiopia's finance ministry. And Tanzania is expecting its economy to bounce back in 2022 after the damage inflicted by the COVID-19 pandemic.
Business in Africa is at the crossroads, where opportunity meets innovation, where profitable new markets collide with global trends. From the sound of an African bell on a stock market's floor, to the shout of the trader in a bustling free market. It's colorful, vibrant, and exotic. CGTN stands at the gateway to Europe, Africa, and the Middle East. From Morocco to South Africa, we talk to the deal makers and actors who fuel its engines of growth. Only on CGTN.
Africa Live. Find your voice.
Let's start in Ethiopia. The country's finance ministry has proposed a supplementary budget worth about $2.5 billion to help counter the fallout from a 14-month-long civil war that has destroyed infrastructure, displaced millions, eroded government revenue and deterred investment. Here's Girum Chala with this report from the capital.
The Ethiopian civil war has lasted almost 14 months. It has claimed thousands of lives and led to the eviction of at least 2.5 million people. Now the Ethiopian government has proposed to allocate an additional $2.47 billion to rebuild the war-torn north regions of the country and revamp its entire economy.
We have to work hard to support our people affected by the war, and that includes their families and also those families that have lost their loved ones in this conflict. Apart from government efforts, we expect the people of our country to be mindful of their spending habits and to avoid any excessive spending as much as possible. We must practice the culture of saving and supporting one another too as Ethiopians. That way, our all-rounded efforts can bear fruit.
Already, Ethiopian authorities have confirmed services such as telecommunications, electric and others have resumed in the war-affected regions of the country.
In most of the freed and recaptured areas, services such as telecom, electricity and banks are back for the public. Of course, there are a few places where services are yet to resume, but most areas now have begun to get normal services after strong efforts exerted towards reinstating these areas. The Ethiopian Airlines has also resumed its flights to the cities of Kombolcha and Lalibela. Our special Christmas will also be celebrated in the historic Lalibela city. This will be a great opportunity for those believers to witness the current condition of the churches after the invasion.
Ethiopia has already a plan of vast economic growth under Prime Minister Abiy Ahmed's Prosperity Party. The economic reform of the nation aims to achieve the goals of putting Ethiopia as one of the middle-income economies in the world soon.
Generally, to guarantee the general economic growth and rebuild locations damaged by the rebels and also to prepare for any future challenges, we call upon every citizen of this great nation to join hands.
Ethiopia's economy is in serious need of foreign direct investments to kickstart recovery. And for that, the government is calling on international investors to put their money on its manufacturing, agriculture and services sectors. And there is already good news as authorities here say that FDI is now flowing from Chinese, Turkish and Indian investors to the country. Grumtara CGTN, Addis Ababa, Ethiopia.
Despite a slowdown in growth last year, Tanzania's economy is expected to bounce back in 2022. Analysts are banking their hopes on the COVID-19 pandemic's damage receding and the stabilization of different parts of Tanzania's economy. Here's Daniel Kijo with that story.
For entrepreneur Gilbert Mahia, the last 2 years have been the hardest of his life. The coronavirus pandemic hit his business and his income dropped dramatically. But at the start of 2022, his kids' clothing store is starting to recover. He says sales are now double what they were this time last year.
We already see that 2022 is a different year for us. This is because of the sales that we have already started seeing as the year progresses. This is because of how the president is supporting businesses. Even more tourists are coming in.
Economic experts say ongoing investment in infrastructure, supportive fiscal policies, and the creation of a conducive business environment will see Tanzania's economy return to growth this year.
FDI is starting to pump in the economy, and when that happens, you see that there is that positivity coming both for foreign and local investors, and that can only be good for investment in Tanzania and what comes with it. I'm talking about employment, opportunities, and all ways of having spillover effects to other sectors, which can only improve our economy.
The mining sector is also expected to increase its contribution to the national GDP this year, following the government signing of 4 major contracts with new mining investors. Over the last 9 months, Tanzania has secured loans amounting to $3 billion from the World Bank, the International Monetary Fund, and the Africa Development Bank. The government says the funding will be used to implement a number of projects which it says will stimulate growth. The government, however, is facing criticism from opposition politicians who say the loans are increasing the national debt. But it says the loans will be transferred to the 2022 2023 budget in order to complete major projects like a hydropower dam along Rufiji River, a crude oil pipeline from Uganda, and a liquefied natural gas processing plant. President Samia Suluhu Hassan says all this is in line with the government's mission to improve living standards.
Kama ilivyotamkwa kwenye mpango wa tatu wa serikali,
just as it is stipulated in the third five-year development plan 2021 to 2036 that the main aim is to grow the economy from person to person as well as improving the economy as a whole.
Kama nilivyosema hapo awali.
The new Omicron variant of the coronavirus means it's far from certain that COVID-19 will ease pressure on economies in 2022. But Tanzania's government is hoping key sectors like tourism and mining will help the country's economy to grow again in this third year of the pandemic. Daniel Kijo, CGTN, Dar es Salaam, Tanzania.
Egypt has become the latest country to join the Shanghai-based New Development Bank. Now, the NDB, as you might recall, was set up back in 2015 by the BRICS member states. That's Brazil, Russia, China, India, and South Africa. It's helping to finance development projects in a broad range of developing economies. From Cairo, here's Yasser Hakim with the details.
Egypt is the fourth new member admitted to the China-based lender after Bangladesh, the United Arab Emirates and Uruguay. A statement released by Egypt's finance minister says the New Development Bank has enormous financing capabilities and advanced international expertise that can help Egypt meet its financing needs and maximize its efforts in infrastructure development.
Accepting Egypt is a sign of confidence in the Egyptian economy by the BRICS states, especially how the country has faced the coronavirus pandemic and which was the only economy in the region to post positive growth rates. So this trust will translate into investor confidence and therefore open the door for financing of projects in the country.
Egypt is in the midst of a multi-billion-dollar rebuilding process that began in 2016. It saw a major overhaul of its infrastructure, including new sewage systems, new roads, bridges and highways, modern railway system, and even building 27 new cities countrywide, including the 725-kilometer-squared new administrative capital, which is a smart city the size of Singapore. All these projects have placed a heavy financial burden on the emerging economy.
The benefits of the bank include diversifying the sources of funding at favorable terms. Egypt needs a lot of financing for many projects. Most importantly, there will soon be huge energy projects, especially in natural gas and renewables, as well as social development projects. We have a target to focus on clean energy projects as well, which is expected to cost about $6 trillion globally, and Egypt wants to have a share in this.
In its 6 years of existence, the New Development Bank has funded about 80 projects worth $30 billion. The projects cover sectors including transport, water and sanitation, clean energy, digital infrastructure, social infrastructure and urban development. The North African nation hopes it will be able to tap into this financing tool to help achieve its developmental goals. Yes, Hakim for CGTN, Cairo.
Still in the North African region, authorities in Tunisia have ruled out slashing interest rates. Now, that decision comes amidst a pandemic-induced economic crisis that has been made a lot worse by the ongoing political uncertainty there. Tunisia's central bank left the benchmark rate essentially unchanged at 6.25% in its final meeting of 2021. It opted against making changes despite rising inflation and a forecast of much slower economic growth in 2022. From Tunis, here's CGTN's Anin Chouachi with the details.
Tunisia has said reducing interest rates would not help economic recovery and warned it would instead entail an inflationary spiral. The Minister of Economy and Planning declared that rate cuts would also hurt middle-class families and retirees as the currency will depreciate.
I rule out some hypotheses and classical measures to revive the economy. We cannot cut interest rates because this scenario would entail an inflationary spiral and hit people's purchasing power.
The 2022 state budget set the investment and development-related expenses at $2.9 billion. The minister noted that the North African state's government will not authorize massive public investment as the debt ratio stands at 85%.
Unfortunately, we're aware that this is below expectations because economic actors are looking for measures to boost public investment and development. We must preserve the value of the dinar, which should not depreciate further, especially since we must preserve the major financial balances. We are thinking of solutions to the major stalled public projects.
Many economists believe that there is no way out of the current economic and social crisis without a boost in public and private investment in the country.
The government did not think of the budget of development and investment when drafting the 2022 state budget. The $2.9 billion will never be used for public projects, regional development or infrastructure. It will rather be directed to other state expenses. There will be no economic recovery after the pandemic without public and private investment.
Tunisia's Prime Minister Najla Bouden declared that her government aims to preserve the current industrial fabric, which was affected by the COVID-19 crisis and which has further been complicated by its political situation. The Minister of Economy and Planning announced the launch of a digital platform dedicated to Tunisian and foreign investors in the coming weeks. Authorities say the objective is to achieve economic growth that will increase resources, improve purchasing power, and activate the economic circuit. Adnan Shawishi, CGTN, Tunis.
And I'll leave it there for the time being. I'll be back at the top of the hour, though. In global business, we'll be looking at the latest policy recommendations coming out of the Africa CDC. The directors ruling out lockdowns as a measure to control the spread of COVID. We'll be examining the impact of had on African economies and what tools are available for policymakers as far as healthcare is concerned in 2022. All that and more is coming up at 1800 GMT. For now, back to Mahia.
Rama, thank you. Well, still to come here in the sport. COVID-19 hit Tunisia, set for Sierra Leone friendly on Friday.